The front line is combat at its most brutal. It drives people to extreme acts for many complex reasons.
They were fighting for each other, not for patriotism, but for their buddies.
We reveal the most decisive front lines in the Second World War and take you deep into the heart of battle with the men who were there.
They were attacking with divisions, and I had one rifle company with about 100 men.
I was down to my last box of ammunition. We had no food, and we were hurting.
Hitler's thousand-year Reich must face its nemesis. As the Red Army closes in on Germany's capital.
It's fought its way, in some cases, all the way from the gates of Leningrad and Moscow, and certainly Stalingrad, and they have scores to settle.
The Nazis' genocidal regime will finally collapse as Berlin's captors seize the prize. But right to the end, there'll be a bloody price to pay.
It's incredibly close range, it's incredibly personal, and it's unbelievably violent. It's an ungodly and awful, horrifically nasty battle.
(1945), and the endgame of the war starts to take shape. With the last days of the Reich in sight, all eyes are on the German capital, Berlin.
It's the largest city in Germany. It is one of the largest cities in the world. It is a logistical center of Germany. It is an industrial center. It is the seat of the government. It is the seat of the armed forces.
As both the Western Allies push east and the Soviets push west, the shattered heart of Hitler's Reich is there for the taking. But with Germany in ruins, the Western Allies are lukewarm about joining the fight to take it. They say Berlin is not that important to them. Stalin pretends to agree, but secretly, he wants his Red Army to take the capital at all costs.
Let's start with April Fool's Day, 1st of April 1945. Eisenhower sends Stalin a famous telegram. And essentially it reads that the Allied armies are not interested in taking Berlin, and therefore the field is open for Stalin to do that. And Stalin sends this amazing telegram back saying, well, neither are we. Which is a complete travesty, because there's nothing he would like more than to capture Berlin, and the whole of the Russian war effort has been directed to really settling scores, and Berlin would be the pinnacle of that.
Stalin now has Berlin in his sights, and as the Red Army advances towards the city, he starts to make plans to crush it.
Once Eisenhower says, over to you, then all bets are off. That's Stalin saying, right, we will capture Berlin, there's going to be no pressure in time, no one else is going to be breathing down our necks, we're not in competition with any of the other Allied powers, I'm going to capture Berlin in my own time and in my own way.
Stalin gives his commanders a punishing schedule to take the city. He wants an attack to start in 2 weeks, and the Soviet flag to be flying over Berlin 2 weeks after that. Stalin's plan is to take Berlin on 3 fronts and encircle it. A direct assault into the city from the east. In the north, to sweep around Berlin and attack it from the west and northwest, while linking up with the Western Allies. And to do the same around the south, encircling Berlin and crushing it. For Stalin, it will be the crowning glory of a long-fought war of revenge.
He really saw Berlin as the center of Nazi Germany. He saw capturing Berlin as a moment when the Soviet Union would quite literally physically overrun the Nazis, in much the same way that the Nazis believed that capturing Moscow would be the symbolic moment of the conquest of the Soviet Union.
Berlin might be the symbolic prize, but in April 1945, it has little of its former glory. A bombed-out wasteland. Its population has been dramatically reduced.
The civilian population of Berlin had suffered through 6 years of warfare, and even though they were in the center of Germany, they had taken quite a lot of casualties and a lot of damage from Allied strategic bombing of Berlin. Tens of thousands of Berliners had died in those bombing raids. In addition, they were suffering from shortages of food, from shortages of consumer goods.
But the civilian population cannot look forward to the end of the war with optimism. Thousands of German refugees from the Reich's eastern territories bring accounts of Red Army atrocities west.
The civilian population of Berlin were absolutely petrified about the forthcoming arrival of the Red Army, and they had good reason to do so.
Everybody in the Red Army has a relative who's been killed by the Germans. The conservative estimate of Russians killed in the Great Patriotic War is in excess of 20 million. So every single one of those soldiers is bent on revenge.
Rumors of what Russian soldiers did to enemy populations had started to spread within the city. And so the civilian population of Berlin was sort of living in this state of kind of suspended animation and terror as they waited for the Russians to arrive. There wasn't a lot they could do about it. All they could do was wait and see what happened to them.
Stalin spares nothing in his drive to win his prize. He will throw over 2 million troops and thousands of guns, aircraft, and tanks at the city. Berlin now faces a force almost as great as Hitler deployed to invade the whole of Soviet Russia 4 years earlier. And trying to stop them? The shredded remnants of the German army, a shadow of its former self.
Let's just take a snapshot of the German army. At this stage, it is all but disintegrated. Divisions no longer have any meaning. They are scratch forces full of volunteers. There aren't a lot of tanks. There aren't a lot of anything. It's the very young, the very old, some cynical old soldiers, a few SS fanatics. This is a rabble and a shadow of the former German armed forces.
They had suffered enormous casualties over the last 4 years, and the forces that were defending Berlin were a mix of some experienced and effective soldiers, but a lot of wounded veterans who had maybe only partially recovered, a lot of older men who had been drafted in at the last second, and a lot of very young boys, teenagers, 12, 13, 14, or 15, who had been pressed into service because there was nobody left to fight. The Germans didn't really have the ability to defend Berlin against the Soviet tsunami, the metal tsunami that was coming, but they had to do the best they could.
The Red Army is a completely different beast. It's millions strong, outnumbering the Germans in every possible way, matched perhaps only in ideology and determination. It is so imbued with Soviet doctrine and ideology. It's fought its way, in some cases, all the way from the gates of Leningrad and Moscow, and certainly Stalingrad, and they have scores to settle.
Stalin's forces may be vast in number, but his commanders rely on almost inexhaustible supplies of artillery, ammunition, and firepower.
The Soviets relied very heavily on overwhelming artillery support, overwhelming use of tank numbers and tank destroyers, and just sort of a sledgehammer to crush a German nut.
Preoccupying the top players in Russian military politics is who gets to take Berlin. The generals under Stalin are each desperate to be credited as the captors of the prize. Leading the Red Army into the heart of the city is Georgy Zhukov of the 1st Belarusian Front. Son of a village cobbler, he's a military man to his boots. Commanding the 1st Ukrainian Front to the south of the city, with orders to encircle Berlin from the west, is Zhukov's deadly rival, Marshal Ivan Konev. To the north of Berlin, Konev and Rokossovsky is charged with taking the 2nd Belarusian Front to connect with the Allies and also encircle Berlin. But the man most determined to be crowned the victor will be nowhere near the front line.
The big worry in Stalin's mind is that whoever captures Berlin will be the Russian hero forever. And of course, in Joe Stalin's mind, there is only one Russian hero, and that is Stalin himself.
To keep his generals in line, Stalin uses a tried and tested political trick.
He pitted his generals against each other as rivals, and Zhukov and General Konev were really set against each other to see who could capture the city most quickly and most effectively. It's not an uncommon thing for dictators to do, is to set themselves up as the people who are ultimately going to resolve the rivalries. Make subordinates fight each other, and you're the person they're going to come to solve the problem.
Facing the Red Army are some of the Germans' most determined and experienced commanders. General Helmut Wiedling, commanding the 56th Panzer Corps, will face the Russian onslaught in the initial phases of the battle and later take command of the defense of Berlin. His commander is a highly experienced expert in defensive warfare, General Gotthard Heinrici. He is leading Army Group Vistula, tasked with stopping the Soviet army at the eastern approaches to the city. Reporting to him, a loyal member of Hitler's inner circle, General Lieutenant Theodor Busse of the 9th Army. Stalin orders his star general Georgy Zhukov to take his 1st Belarusian army from the river Oder and to attack the main German defensive line at Seelow Heights.
На нашем участке фронта, я воевал тогда, Первый Белорусский фронт, маршал Зhukov командовал. Мы уже все знали.
The heights are a heavily defended ridge looking down on a boggy plain crisscrossed by narrow roads.
И мы тогда уже себя чувствовали с немцами совершенно на равных, абсолютно не боялись их. Тем более эти годы были годами наступления русской армии. Уже была и наша авиация в действии. Нам очень помогали «Катюши», которые прикрывали наши войска. И дух, военный дух был достаточно, я считаю, высокий.
For the ordinary civilians, familiar homes, streets and neighborhoods are quickly turning into a battlefield.
Roof tiles were flung all over. Windows were shattered and cracks appeared in the front brick wall. Shortly thereafter, we heard the chatter of heavy machine gun fire. As the noise got closer, we could hear explosions and rifle fire right in our immediate vicinity. We could even hear the horrible guttural screaming of the Soviet soldiers. Shots shattered our windows and shells exploded in our garden.
On the 16th of April, Zhukov unleashes everything he has to take the Seelow Heights.
And he wants to be very, very quick, because he understands that Konev in the south is also launching an attack, and he who gets to Berlin first will get the prize, will be the great victor of the Battle of Berlin.
Стволов. 2000 стволов. Представляете, какая концентрация была? 2000 стволов с «Катюшами», с тяжелой артиллерией. И еще один вопрос. У нас была зенитная артиллерия, которая стреляла по наземным войскам. Вот и все это было 3000, 2000 на километр.
A vast artillery barrage hurls shells in a devastating rain of fire that rips up a wide front. But General Gotthard Heinrici has prepared well.
He knew how the Soviets were going to fight. So what he does, before the artillery bombardment actually starts, he withdraws his troops from the first defensive line and puts them back into the second main line of defense, which is in and around the Seelow Heights.
Instead of pummeling the German infantry defending Seelow, Zhukov's artillery simply plows up unmanned earth for kilometers, while his targets are safely out of reach. With time now slipping by, Zhukov sends in the tanks. They attack Seelow in narrow columns, concentrated on the few roads, and they make perfect targets for the German defenders.
By this stage, all the anti-aircraft guns, 88mm guns, have been brought from Berlin, and these start engaging the Soviet tanks, and they knock out one after the other. And you might say it becomes a bit of a turkey shoot.
It's the first day of the attack, and already Zhukov is failing, and worse is to come. The infantry should be walking over dead Germans after the artillery barrage, but instead come up against a fearsome and determined defense. The Russians are decimated.
The kind of flexibility and tactical strength of the German army worked really well in defense against these kind of Soviet assaults. And all of this comes together at the Battle of Seelow Heights. They are able to sort of fend off Zhukov much more effectively initially than he, and particularly Stalin, expected.
Sustaining extremely high losses, Zhukov has been humiliated by an enemy with a fraction of the resources. And the Russian general knows he is being watched closely by Stalin.
The thing to always remember about Soviet generals is that they know that failure often comes with a bullet at the end of it. Stalin was not a patient man, and he had executed a lot of Soviet generals throughout the war for failing to achieve what he had set for them.
In classic style, Stalin turns to Zhukov's deadly rival, Marshal Konev, and hands him an opportunity he would never have dreamed possible.
Konev, at this stage, had been told to stay south of Berlin and concentrate on surrounding Berlin. So all of a sudden, Konev, much to his surprise, is given permission to wade into the southern suburbs himself, rather than just simply sort of surrounding the city.
Seizing his moment, Konev is ruthless. His tank army tears through the southern suburbs of Berlin, meeting little resistance.
Stalin is a very clever psychological manipulator, and he understands that both his generals will now push their armies harder than ever because they're now in competition with each other. And by doing that, they will waste and spend lives as much as their leader wants, because the prize is not keeping their casualties low, the prize is eliminating fascism and taking the heart of Berlin.
Having lost 30,000 men in 4 days, Zhukov finally prevails at Seelow Heights and breaks through, cutting the German 9th Army in 3. The road to Berlin is open, but he is terribly behind schedule. And he now has his rival Konev to contend with. Stalin wants the Soviet flag flying over Berlin by May the 1st, the great Soviet holiday celebrating Labor Day. It's just 10 days away, and Zhukov knows he doesn't care which general gives it to him.
The war is coming towards Berlin. What was a distant grumble yesterday is a permanent drum today. You inhale gun noise. The ear is deaf. It only hears the firing of the heaviest calibers. The direction can no longer be made out. We live in a ring of pipes that narrows every hour.
In Berlin, and deep underground, Adolf Hitler is micromanaging the war and the defense of Berlin. He trusts fewer and fewer of his commanders. The day after Seelow falls, Hitler celebrates his birthday and receives visitors from all over Germany.
All the leaders fly in to present Hitler with birthday presents. The Russian guns can be heard in the distance. And Hitler is, at this stage, still believing in miracles, in relief armies coming to bail Berlin out of trouble. Himmler turns up, Goering turns up, and it's the last time everybody is sort of seen together.
One of the things about Hitler was that, especially by 1945, he had really kind of lost touch with reality. And he wasn't willing for his subordinate generals to tell him anything different than what he believed. So Hitler is ordering imaginary units around the battlefield maps, and his own generals are too afraid to tell him that they don't exist. Where his closest Nazi advisors, people like Himmler and Goering, are telling him complete nonsense because they don't want to upset him and have his wrath turned on them.
The Soviet armies are now focused on one objective, taking the center of Berlin and the prize of all prizes, the Reichstag building. Long disused, its historical symbolism mesmerizes the Kremlin.
Stalin was particularly fixated with the Reichstag because that's really where the Nazis began their climb to power. Hitler started off in the Reichstag, and so the Soviets taking that building would really be a symbolic destruction of the Nazi control.
You show the world, the Soviet people, that you have defeated Hitler, you've defeated Berlin, and you've defeated the Nazi Reich. So to the Soviets, this was of utmost importance.
But to reach the Reichstag, the Red Army will have to penetrate a city that has been working for months to make that as difficult as possible, and where Hitler has ordered defensive preparations to make it impregnable.
The German plans to defend Berlin should be separated into the actual plans and the sort of imaginary plans that Hitler came up with. But on the flip side, his generals were also putting together a fairly substantial defense of Berlin. And that defense was based on the idea that urban fighting is enormously difficult and enormously costly for the attacker. So the idea was to use Berlin itself as a fortress, or a Festung, as the Germans called it.
Every street, railway yard, canal and embankment is now repurposed into makeshift ramparts of Fortress Berlin.
It included basically drafting most of the population of Berlin to work as laborers, constructing fortifications, and putting together kill zones and bunkers to try and drive off Soviet units, and then putting together what forces they had left to occupy Berlin and the areas around it and defend it.
A whole city is now packed with tank traps and machine gun nests in a highly organized set of rings, each more fortified than the last. But with fuel supplies almost exhausted and the whole project manual labor, not all of Hitler's plans materialize.
The military jargon said that it would take the Soviets exactly 15 minutes to overcome the obstacles on the outskirts of Berlin, because they would drive up, they would look at it, laugh for 14 minutes, and then simply 1 minute it would take them to drive over them. So there was actually nothing really prepared on the outskirts.
The barricades, built of paving stones and reinforced with all kinds of junk, rusted cars and bathtubs, are not impressive. And we cannot imagine that they will be a serious obstacle to Stalin's large tanks. It will be over in 2 or 3 days, we say.
Far greater effort was put into the center of the city, the location of Hitler's bunker.
The Germans start preparing the fortress, or the citadel, which is the most inner defensive ring, and this stretches all the way to the historic center of town, the new Reich Chancellery. It included the Führer bunker, so Hitler was sitting in that inner defense perimeter.
And just as the defences of Berlin stiffened towards the centre, so did the calibre of men. For as well as the old men of the Volkssturm and the boys of the Hitler Youth, there were the fanatical units of the Waffen-SS, many from outside Germany.
These were volunteers from mainly occupied nations. The majority of those were French SS from the Charlemagne division. And there was also the 11th SS Nordland Division, which was Danes, Swedes and Norwegians.
Crouching behind T-34 tanks and self-propelled guns, the assault troops of Konev's and Zhukov's guards fight up the streets and parklands of suburban Berlin.
The original resistance by the Germans is very, very light because the resistance hasn't really been organized. And it's only really when they hit the metro circle of Berlin that the German fighting really intensifies.
Первое серьезное сопротивление немцы оказали нам при подходе к Берлину. 22 апреля наш полк ворвался на окраины Берлина. Это Карлскост, кажется, называлась окраина. И вот там завязались первые достаточно сильные бои.
As the Soviets penetrate the city, the attack will slow down to stop-start street fighting, involving surprise attacks and ambushes, and the advantage shifts to the defenders, who can exploit their local knowledge. Outside Berlin, two German armies are slowly disintegrating. In the south, the remnants of the 9th Army of General Lieutenant Theodor Busse are encircled, while in the north, the last panzers of Army Group Vistula give way to Rokossovsky's 2nd Belarusian Front. On the 25th of April, Soviet and American forces meet on the River Elbe. It's an epic moment. Germany is now effectively split in two. Over the next 3 days, the city is gradually squeezed, and successive districts and defensive positions fall to the Soviet tank and guards armies. Bridges and a power station, industrial complexes and metro stations are all taken, as the battle's epicenter slowly moves to the Reichstag. Hitler's advisors urge the Führer to leave Berlin with his entourage and hold out in his mountain retreat, Berchtesgaden, high in the Bavarian mountains, over 500 kilometers away.
And there are lots of tunnels there are lots of caves, there's lots of underground headquarters and bunkers and so on. And it's a natural place for everyone to go because that's where Hitler always felt most at ease. He never liked living in Berlin. He loved the mountain air, and his staff were used to working in that environment anyway. So there are several Junkers 52s ready to take all the personnel, all their files, down to Bavaria.
Bavaria might be surrounded by the Allies, but there was a good reason for his staff to want to see out the last days of the war there.
If you're going to be captured by the Russians, you're going to have a miserable time. And you're probably going to spend the rest of your life in a gulag. And so most people, if they're going to be captured at all, would far rather be captured by the Brits or the Americans than the Russians. And so Berchtesgaden also is a lure because clearly that's where the Americans and French are going to be, not the Russians.
The Führer's decision to stay in Berlin shocks his staff and supporters. For the first time, it's clear that the survival of the leader is not uppermost in his mind.
He's creating the image and the idea of a dominant Third Reich centered on the Nazis, centered on the Aryan race and the Germans. And that Berlin is really the central city of this. The Führer bunker, the Reichstag, all of the places in the city itself. This is Germany personified. And frankly, I think by the end, for all his delusional state of mind, he knew the war was lost. So he essentially decided better to die a hero, as he saw it, than flee and possibly lose the symbolism that went with Berlin.
As Soviet troops range through the Berlin suburbs, they wreak the revenge that everyone expected. But it is on a scale no one dared imagine. Over 100,000 women and girls in Berlin are raped.
The Soviet High Command essentially knew what was going on, and they didn't so much encourage it as allow it to go on without much in the way of discipline or punishment for this. They accepted this as something of a natural fact of life and let their soldiers do what they wanted to do. And the result was quite a horrific outpouring of violence on the German civilians, and most horrifically on German women.
In the territories recovered by the Red Army during the war, as many as 2 million women are raped and hundreds of thousands die as a result. Soviet fighters now move into the dense, high-rise center of Berlin. It's where the Germans, with their genius for defensive warfare, will be at their greatest advantage.
Urban warfare is a completely different kind of warfare than in most other kinds of conflict. It's defined by the city itself, by the buildings, by the streets, by the population. And it's utterly unlike what the Soviets and Germans had been doing in most of the Eastern Front.
Изо всех, там все-таки было много, очень много войск еще было в самом городе, и они, очень сильное сопротивление было. Они обстреливали из окон, из откуда хотите. Видно, когда я пролетал над Берлином, я видел все это, что это происходило. И там пожары были, очень много было подожжено домов от этого. Я видел передвижение этих войск. Конечно, я не высоко летал, мы же летали низко. И это, конечно, была мясорубка. Это была мясорубка, потому что очень сильное сопротивление было тех войск, которые остались в самом Берлине.
Late April 1945, the Red Army was taking Berlin, street by street and house by house. Some of the Red Army soldiers were armed with this, the M1891 Moisant-Nagant rifle. Bolt action, internal 5-round magazine, iron sights, extremely accurate weapon.
Berlin's front line now evolves into one of snipers and tank-killing ambushes. The Russian tank crews are suddenly highly exposed, while their attackers can melt into the ruins with ease.
A Russian tank column moving along a main boulevard into the centre of Berlin, that what the Germans would be looking to do is to rob them of their protection by destroying typically the first tank in the line and then the last tank. They're then trapped, they can't go left and right, and by then it's shooting fish in a barrel.
The key thing about urban warfare is that it's very difficult and very slow going and enormously bloody. When you have tanks and vehicles, you naturally want to move down the roads of the city. But there you're absolutely visible to the defenders, and the defenders have set up all of their heavy weaponry, their machine guns, their artillery, to range in on those streets. The streets, it turns out, are actually a death trap.
The defenders have created an environment designed to lure in and destroy the Soviets.
As the Soviets pushed in, they found themselves subject to enormous amount of firepower and started suffering horrific casualties.
Now, the only way of taking the city is not street by street, or even building by building, but room by room.
What they learned very quickly is that you actually have to move through the buildings. The ordinary infantry had to go into the buildings on each side and then start clearing each building of German defenders, blowing a hole in the walls into the next building. And it's only after the infantry has cleared the defenders from all the buildings, you can move the tanks and the artillery forward. And the fighting goes from being these long-range and intensively large tank battles to being Soviet soldiers on one floor firing up staircases at German soldiers on the next floor up. While those same German soldiers throw down hand grenades to try and blow up the Soviet attackers. It's incredibly close range, it's incredibly personal, and it's unbelievably violent.
Caught in the middle of all of this chaos and destruction were a couple of million German civilians cowering in cellars, down in the underground, anywhere they could find where they thought they might be safe from what was going on above them.
As the Soviets break into the buildings and start attacking the German defenders there, they're also encountering German civilians who are getting killed and slaughtered in the fighting just as badly as the soldiers. It's an ungodly and awful, horrifically nasty battle.
Most of the city is in ruins. But even now, Nazi fanatics are determined to fight to the last. SS squads roam the streets, looking for any signs of weakness, and in particular, white flags. They summarily execute anyone found trying to surrender.
Every house that hoists a white flag is a plague bacillus and will experience the treatment it deserves.
We are vegetating in a ghost town, without electric light or gas, without water. We are forced to think of personal hygiene as a luxury and hot meals as abstract concepts. We are living like ghosts in a vast field of ruins. A city where nothing works, apart from the telephones that sometimes ring, glumly and pointlessly, beneath piles of fallen masonry.
In a forest south of Berlin, the shattered remnants of Busse's 9th Army attempts to break out from the Soviet encirclement. But the Red Army are ready and waiting.
Their response was one of massive, overwhelming violence. The 9th Army and all of the German civilians and hangers-on who had coalesced around it were immolated. The destruction was commented on by eyewitnesses at the time as being truly breathtaking.
In the end, only about a third of the German forces, about 30,000 men, actually successfully escaped. The rest of them are either killed, wounded, or captured by the Russians in this pocket.
In central Berlin, German forces are now reduced to defending a small strip enclosing the government district. But they have numerous strongpoints to make every approach formidable. But with Stalin's brutal timetable driving Zhukov on, his men will stop at nothing to take the building.
Obstacles that they had in their way was that they were going to have to cross the Spree River and get over the Moltke Bridge. Of course, the German defenders knew that, and so on, and positioned all their defences accordingly.
The fighting there is quite severe. The Soviets take quite some casualties. Eventually they manage to seize the bridge, they push across it, and they now reach Königsplatz, which is the square in front of the Reichstag.
This was a huge open space that was in effect a killing ground for any troops that wanted to get across it. However, they were determined by this stage not to take a step back, and in a fantastic successful operation managed to get across the Königsplatz to actually get to the doorways of the Reichstag itself.
Some of the Soviet soldiers managed to cross the river by avoiding the Moltke Bridge altogether.
Вот, товарищ Ярхин, получен приказ Ставки, то есть товарища Сталина, перейти Шпрее и ворваться в центр Берлина. Любыми средствами надо это сделать. Слава Богу, я вспомнил, что где-то недалеко по карте я видел, есть мост. Послали туда быстро наших разведчиков. Они пришли, мост разрушен. Но говорят, если по этому мосту, то можно перебраться по его разрушенным частям. И пока мы стреляли, саперы успели навести эти досточки, уложить как-то, где доски, где просто проволоку. И мы сумели под нашим артиллерийским огнем перебраться на ту сторону. Захватили первые несколько домиков, артиллерию сигналом ракеты отвели огонь в другую часть, и почти весь батальон, но я повторяю, это было где-то меньше 200 человек тогда уже, мы захватили плацдарм на этом берегу реки Шпрее. Вот за это я получил уже первой степени Ордена Отечественной войны.
In the Führer bunker, Hitler marries Eva Braun, and shortly afterwards is told that Berlin's defenders are about to run out of ammunition. Staff ask for permission to break out of Berlin and escape. Hitler forbids it. In the afternoon of April the 30th, Hitler kills himself.
He actually commits suicide, and in sort of typical Nazi overkill, he not only swallows poison but shoots himself to make sure that the job gets done effectively.
Eva Braun also takes her life with the cyanide tablet Hitler has given her. Their bodies are burned in the garden of the Reich Chancellery. Many of the Soviet soldiers attacking the Reichstag were equipped for close combat with one of these.
As the Red Army stormed Berlin, this weapon came to the fore. This is the PPSH-41, fully automatic machine pistol. 70-round magazine. This weapon can fire single shot, but it's not designed for that. This weapon is designed to fire fully automatic. Taking the Reichstag was a grim task. There were some 2,000 SS soldiers defending it. The Soviets had to take it room by room, corridor by corridor, and this was the weapon they used.
On reaching the Reichstag, the Soviet Rifle Division find a massively defended building full of fanatical fighters, and Stalin's deadline for taking it is just hours away.
The building had been fortified. They had bricked up some of the entranceways. They'd used a lot of rubble. The destruction that had been wrought on it made it, in so many ways, a very defendable place.
Eventually, the Soviets managed to blast their way into the building using dynamite.
They then had to fight their way through room by room, staircase by staircase, through the Reichstag against defenders who, for them, it really was their last stand.
While other Soviet units spread to other official buildings around the Reichstag, the upper floors are secured. With the battle raging below, several soldiers and official photographers scale the exterior roof of the Reichstag to hoist the Soviet flag. An act of carefully staged political propaganda that delivers to Stalin exactly what he's ordered.
The capture of the Reichstag looks spontaneous. The Russian troops roll up there, they go up to the top, they raise a flag. Not a bit of it. This has been carefully thought about for a long time beforehand. Specific orders from Stalin, NKVD fighting troops. And even the flag that's unfurled has been made specially for the occasion. It's unusually large. It's been made from bedspreads of the appropriate colour, found, stitched together, long before the troops ever get to the Reichstag. But who is this image really for? It's partly for the Russian people, but more importantly, the real rationale behind that picture is it's for the Germans. You need a common image which says to the German people, Berlin has fallen to the Red Army, your worst nightmares have come true, and that is it, complete and total defeat in a way you could never have conceived of.
Так было там развалено и разрушено, и сплошные пожары были. Я даже не мог себе представить, что можно это восстановить. Совершенно. Но я видел много городов разрушенных. Я видел Минск, я видел Бобруйск, я видел много городов разрушенных. Но Берлин был разрушен до основания.
Berlin may be a smoking ruin under Soviet control and Hitler dead, but the remaining German high command still tries to negotiate the non-negotiable.
The German defenders were desperate to avoid the prospect of an unconditional surrender. They knew by this stage that they were going to lose, of course, but what they wanted was to have some conditions imposed within the surrender that would be to their advantage. So that will be, for instance, all officers will be allowed to carry and keep their sidearms and so on, and that their wounded will be treated well accordingly, etc., and that they will be able to almost work in partnership with the Soviets to take over the remaining areas of the city. The Germans, in their desperation to avoid that scenario, met a Soviet delegation at the Tempelhof airport and tried to negotiate. They were met by a very Soviet no, and the next morning General Zhukov unleashed more of his enormous weight of firepower on the remaining parts of the city under German control in an effort to get them to hand over the city unconditionally.
Just after midnight on the 1st of May, the Red Army gets a message from the headquarters of General Helmut Widling, the commander of Berlin, asking for a ceasefire. The Soviets agree, but that now triggers a vast refugee problem.
There were millions of people moving around not only Berlin, but around Germany. And a lot of those were soldiers, both Soviet and German, but a lot of those were civilians. Hundreds of thousands of people are literally trying to flee the city and get whatever refuge they could, whether it's somewhere else in Germany, whether it's somewhere in Austria, whether it's getting to the American and British lines. The German civilians want to get away.
Meanwhile, in the Führer bunker, two senior Nazis, Martin Bormann and Wilhelm Munke, attempt to escape Berlin with a group of junior staff. Nearly all are killed, but the breakout triggers a Soviet clampdown that will mean the deaths of thousands more civilians, desperate to escape to the Western Allies.
Stalin wanted to capture as much of the leadership as he could, and so the response was for the Soviets to try and keep the German civilians within Berlin, something that they often executed with extreme violence. Crowd control is hard if you're not trained for it, and the only tool that the Soviet soldiers really had was their weaponry, and they proved all too willing to use it.
The fleeing crowds make for Berlin's exit roads, and in the mayhem are forced onto two bridges that will get them to safety.
In Berlin, the way to get out of the city is via bridges. They moved in particular towards the Charlottenburg Bridge and the Weidendahmer Bridge, and there they knew they had to get to the other side in order to try and get to some kind of safety. The Soviets had weapons pointed at those bridges, machine guns, tanks, artillery. But in the semi-hysteria that gripped the thousands of fleeing civilians and armed personnel, they literally stampeded in a human wave across the bridge. They came under mass fire, and the casualties were utterly, utterly dreadful. And as a result, barely a handful managed to escape.
The last few days of the war were an unbelievable scene of chaos and death and horror.
As Soviet forces struggled to contain the population of Berlin, Wiedeling and his staff surrender unconditionally to the Soviet Union. The battle for Berlin is over.
Ну, это было такое радостное настроение, что вот, хотя во время этого радостного настроения, во время этого штурма Берлина 100 тысяч погибло людей. Ну, война есть война, что ничего нельзя сделать. Вот это я все, что я могу вам сказать.